Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the 7th episode of our Tool Talk series covering the launch of our newest open source tool, CloudFox. I'm your host, Joe Seckman, AVP of R&D here at Bishop Fox, and joining me today are the authors of CloudFox, Seth Art and Carlos Vendramini. Seth, Carlos, please take a moment to introduce yourselves.
Hey everybody, my name is Seth Art and I'm a principal consultant here at Bishop Fox. I've been at Bishop Fox for about 3.5 years now, and I live in upstate New York.
And I'm Carlos Vendramini. I'm a senior consultant at Bishop Fox. I've been here for about 1.5 years. And Seth and I have been working together a lot on cloud penetration tests, and we're really excited to share this tool and this work that we did with the community.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for joining me today. Before we dive straight into the demos and talking about the details of CloudFox, just wanted to kind of set the stage here with a couple intro questions and some background. Seth, what problem is CloudFox trying to solve?
Yeah, so when you are doing a penetration test or even a security assessment on an unfamiliar cloud environment, so a client environment or one that you don't know all the ins and outs of, it takes a while to get situated. You can use tools like Scout Suite or Prowler, and they kind of download a whole bunch of information and present it to you. And that's really helpful, but they are mainly focused on adherence to CIS benchmarks and other baselines. There's other tools like Cloud Mapper, which is more similar to CloudFox, but really a lot of these tools, they're giving you findings, things that you could work off of and validate whether they're false positives or not. Whereas CloudFox is really just giving you, the penetration tester, the information that you need to look for attack paths. Now, sometimes these are simple things, but sometimes they're more of a chained attack path that, once you get a lay of the land, that's when the attack path becomes apparent to you.
Okay, excellent. So Carlos, we heard a little bit about kind of the problems that CloudFox is trying to solve. So what made you guys think about just creating this tool, CloudFox?
That's an excellent question, Joe. So when we were pen testing with the AWS CLI, a lot of the times we had to use grep, awk, JQ, or a combination of these binaries to get the information that we needed, and that worked for us to a point. But when we tested large environments that were more complex, the results started to get more complex as well. So it made more sense to use a full-fledged programming language in that case. We picked Go because of how present Go is in the cloud space. And it's also easy to distribute that are available SDKs for cloud. So it was a good choice for the tool.
Excellent. So I guess one question that also comes to mind is dependencies. Seth, are there any dependencies to run CloudFox? What do you need?
Yeah, so you need permissions in the cloud environment. You need the binary, of the CloudFox binary, or you can build it yourself if you want. But you mainly need read-only permissions to the assessed environment. And on our GitHub page, we kind of have a list of the different options you have. We recommend Security Auditor, which covers maybe 90% of the checks that CloudFox looks for. But there are also things in Security Auditor that we look for in CloudFox that we don't have permission with just that Security Auditor policy. So we have another policy in our repository that you can apply to the same principle. And with those two together, you can have all of the permissions you need to look at identify some really interesting things. So it's really just the binary, the permissions. The easiest way to use CloudFox with AWS is to use profiles, but the Golang SDK supports, if you're running CloudFox on an EC2 instance that has an IAM instance profile, that'll just work automatically. If you are using environment variables, that'll just work as well. So we got really lucky with the way that the AWS Golang SDK works.
Okay, excellent. So I'm hearing a lot of AWS talk. Does CloudFox only support AWS? Is there anything else? Or Carlos, maybe you can shine a little light on that.
Yes, we definitely have a roadmap planned for the tool. We just happen to see more AWS environments in our daily work than anything else. So it made sense to build that functionality, that AWS functionality first. But we have here at Bishop Fox, we have our internal methodologies that cover Azure, GCP, and Kubernetes as well. Most likely Azure is going to be next in the roadmap. There are already a few Azure functionalities available in this first release, even though they are still under development. And in addition to that, Seth and I, we love Kubernetes. So that is also planned support at some point.
Okay. All right, excellent. Well, without any further ado, I will step aside and let you two take over with the demo. Seth, I believe I'll hand it over to you. I will fade out to the background and monitor for questions. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to post them up in the chat. Take it away, Seth.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. So I'm going to share my screen now. So before we get going, I just wanted to kind of orient everybody with the tool and kind of some of the design decisions we've made. And then what we're going to do is walk through some of the individual commands and how they work. We're not going to, in this live stream, most likely not going to cover the complex chaining of different commands, but our blog post has an example of how we would use 3 or 4 or 5 of these commands in a row. And actually the video attached to the blog post has another example of how we use CloudFox. It's mostly we're using, one module to give us one command to give us the information that feeds into the next command that feeds into the next. So we're going to do a little bit more of a survey on this tool talk. So to start, we have the CloudFox binary here, and you could see the first subcommand is AWS or Azure. It's Cobra. It uses the Cobra module, so it has completion built in. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the help for CloudFox AWS. And so every subcommand is listed here. Before we get into the subcommands, let's talk about some of the flags and the default behavior. So by default, CloudFox records all of the output to a CloudFox-output directory in your current directory. This is really important for us. As penetration testers, we really like to run the tool and then have this data to analyze, to parse after the fact. So it can either be in a table, an ASCII table, or in CSV, and by default, we actually output both. And then I think I touched on this already. If you want to just supply a profile name, this uses the AWS credentials file and the AWS config file, just like the AWS CLI does. So it's as simple as just giving a profile name. Without the profile name, it will do all of the things that the AWS CLI will do. Like, as I mentioned, it will look at environment variables. It'll look for the metadata service to try to derive credentials from those sources. Lastly, is the verbosity. So some of the commands print thousands of lines. So we made the decision that by default, the commands will give you control messages. So say we're about to run this. We found maybe 7 of this thing that you're looking for, and we wrote it to this file on disk or these files on disk. Now, in our examples in this tool talk and most of the ones in the blog, we used the verbosity 2, which prints the control message and the module output. So setting that stage, I'm going to pass it over to Carlos to walk through some of the modules or some of the commands.
Thanks, Seth. So why don't we start with the role trusts, since that was the very first one that we wrote for the tool. And, as some of you may know, every AWS role has a trust policy that determines who can assume each role. And the output in there, you'll see 2 tables. The first table shows all the roles that can be assumed by other principals. And the second table shows all the roles that can be assumed by Amazon services. In secure role trusts, they can be used to escalate privileges within the same account and also between different accounts when it's misconfigured or overly permissive. And this module is really useful to enumerate that type of vulnerability. Another interesting one for enumeration is the instances command, which lists all the EC2 instances, external and internal IPs when available, and also the instance profiles. This is very useful for both network attacks and IAM-based attacks on EC2. You can use your favorite network tool like Nmap to reach out to these IPs and attack them when they are available. You can also look for, what roles are associated to that instance profile And then if there is any of these roles are overly privileged enough, that allows for an IAM-based privilege escalation. In addition to that, there is a really good flag in that command called user data. If you run the command with -- user data, it will list all the contents of the user data attribute for the EC2 instances. User data typically stores scripts used for startup of the instance. And as you see in the example, there's some clear text credentials in there. That is a common clear text data store. And you may, if you have read access to that, you may be able to use that on your privilege escalation path. Speaking of common clear text data stores, it's also worth mentioning the envvars or envars command, which lists the environment variables for Lambda, EC2, App Runner, and other services. So again, anybody with read access to these may find and may use the information there for attack paths. Another useful data store command is the secrets one that lists all the secrets from secrets manager and the SSM parameters that are stored in the account. It's worth noting that these are legit places to store sensitive data such as credentials. However, insecure access to these services, say with an overly privileged role, for example, could result in a high impact finding or in a high impact attack path. If you do happen to find, say, an access key, an AKIA key, for example, for AWS in one of these data stores, there's a really good command that you can use to validate if that key is valid and in scope. And it's the access keys command, which lists all the valid keys and their owners. So if you find something, if you find an access key and you want to make sure that it's in scope, that it can be used in that account, you can compare against the output that you're seeing on the screen right now. And if it's there, you can use it. One last command I want to talk about before I pass it back to Seth, and this is one of my favorite ones. It's the ECR command. It is very useful in Kubernetes tests. We use that a lot. And what it does is it lists all the container images that are stored in the Elastic Container Registry for AWS. And it creates a loot file called ECR pull commands. And this loot file gives you all the commands necessary to authenticate against ECR using Docker, and also pull these images. So you can use Docker to build and investigate the container and see if there's anything else that you or CloudFox might have missed. You can also strip the images layers for different versions of the images file system. See if there's anything used for their source code, whatever you can find. So very good command. Seth, you want to talk about some of the other ones that you find relevant?
Yes, I do. All right. Thanks for somebody reaching out and saying that some of the screen was cut off. Keep giving us that feedback if you can't see anything the way that you think you should be. All right. So the first command that I'm going to talk about is inventory. So inventory is designed to give us a lay of the land of a particular AWS environment. So it's looking at not every service, but some of the more common ones, some of the more popular ones. And it's going to tell us mainly what region is this client using mostly, and what types of services are in this account, for the most part, right? So again, we make it very clear this is not the total number of resources, but when you're comparing 10, 20, 30 different AWS accounts together, you can quickly see which are the big ones, which are the small ones, etc. And you can also kind of get a quick idea of, is this kind of more of a serverless or a serverless cloud native type environment, or is this more of like a lift and shift, hundreds or thousands of EC2 instances, for instance. And you can also get a quick idea of the buckets, the users, and the roles. Now, the next command we can go through is the endpoints module. And what this one does is it looks at all of the cloud services that we know of so far. We're always looking to add more to this. So if you ever think of a way we can extend any of these commands, please, there's a discussion forum on GitHub. There's you can create an issue. We're always looking for the nooks and crannies that we've missed. But basically, for this list of supported services, it's looking to see if there are any AWS endpoints that are accessible. So if your methodology only involves scanning, port scanning, let's say ports on EC2 instances, you're going to miss this whole attack surface area, right? Because there could be a service running in App Runner, which is basically one of the many ways to run containers in AWS. There could be a service behind an Elastic Load Balancer. This is relatively new, but Lambda functions can have their own public URLs at this point. And then also, things like databases have AWS, Amazon AWS URLs or URIs. So this will tell you if it's public. This will tell you if it's private. And as I think we've talked about in the blog post, in the video, and here, a lot of what we do at Bishop Fox is we assume that a compromise has happened, either a user with internal access to the VPC or a compromised workload in your cloud environment. And so in those cases, it's not just about looking for outside ways in. It's if somebody's in, what services are exposed to that attacker, and what can the attacker do next. So we would look to see kind of all of these endpoints, if they require authentication, if there's any information we can get from them. The next command that I'll cover, and the next couple all have to do with IAM, is the principals command. This is very simple. It just prints out all of the users, all of the roles in the count. We use this one to get a lay of the land, but also it's a quick lookup for us to get the ARNs, because some of the other modules, as you see, take the principal ARNs as input. We have one that's lists the permissions, and it by default lists the permissions of every principal, but many times you just want to know what permissions does Carlos have, for instance. So let's go over to that one. So here's the permissions module. And as I mentioned, so this is going to list all 3,400 permissions. Now, the permissions module does not support resource permissions granted via resource policies yet, but it will. It's the equivalent of going in the AWS console and clicking a principal and then kind of expanding each one of the policies applied to that principal and seeing the JSON. I mean, this is what this does, but it's the click of one command. And then what we often do is we can grep. So we can grep for, IAM pass role or STS assume role or something like that, or S3, list bucket, things like that. The other thing you can do is as I mentioned, you can pass one particular principal to this command. So the user polisic or the role polisic, we're going to see just what permissions that role has. And it looks like they can do EC2 instance connect, which is quite an interesting permission. If you've looked at the I Am Vulnerable project and blog post, and it can also do STS assume role on anything, which that's not good either. So we'll get to that. We'll get back to that in a little bit. Now, this one is just simply listing the permissions. It doesn't take into account service control policies, as I mentioned, resource-based policies. So we have another command called IAM simulator, which is really a wrapper for the IAM simulate principal policy API call. And what this does by default is it takes a list of hard-coded permissions that we've hard-coded into CloudFox, ones that are interesting to a penetration tester. And it'll say for every user, for every role, do any of them have access to these interesting permissions? Things like, can they download the images from the container registry? Can they list all the files in all of the buckets and get all the files in all of the buckets? Do they have IAM pass role for any role? Things like that. And so here, what we see at the top is that it's taken an educated guess and that these appear to be administrators, so they can obviously do everything. But then this is the list of roles that have interesting permissions. So as we can see again, Polisic has assume role on everything. Dempsey over here has SSM start session on everything. That's another interesting one. Now there are, here, let's do. I'm going to do the command help. And so we support flags that you can give it to narrow it down. So you can say, for every user and every role, can they do a particular action? Or how about, can one particular principal do this list of hard-coded, interesting permissions? And then lastly, you can even hard-code it and say, can this user do EC2 describe instances on a particular resource? And you'll start to see that some of this sounds a lot like PMapper. PMapper, principal mapper can do the same thing. And so let me show you the loot file here. We give you auto-generated commands, query commands, who can do STS assume role with star. And you can change these. But we try to give you these commands. We find that this module, this command, along with PMapper, are really an excellent kind of, they cover all your bases. PMapper takes into account privilege escalation paths that allow you to do something that you don't explicitly have access to do yet. And IAM Simulator uses AWS's logic itself, so it will actually by default handle SCPs and resource-based policies and everything else. So you get a really good idea of whether you can do something or not. So let's show one example of asking who can perform the action SSM start session, and we should see, I think it was Dempsey, if I remember correctly. But we don't have to wait for that because, as I mentioned earlier, CloudFox logs every command that has been executed already. So we're going to look at the output file. So it's output, and this is a good chance to talk about this, the way this is formatted. So you have CloudFox output. It's always in the subcommand that we're using. And now it uses the profile as the next thing, the output type, and then the name of the module, and with this one, the custom name. And so here we can see that Dempsey, along with the administrators, all have SSM start session. Now, the last one I'd like to show is the outbound assumed roles. For any of you that saw Gerben's blog post recently about how you can use CloudTrail to look for assume role events to identify attack paths that lead from this account out to another account. There's not really any other way to do that. This is the way to look. What we do on our penetration tests is we can use the role trust module in all of our in-scope accounts to identify who can go from one account to the other. But this is a really great one. Oh, we didn't get the, here, let's try. We didn't get the event I was looking for. But this is a really great one to look from this one in-scope account, where are people assuming into? Because what we're really looking for is if this is a lower trust account and there's somebody in this account that can assume into a higher trust account, that would be really interesting for us. And so what you see here is Pulisek in this account is assuming into the role Berhalter in, let's say the fictional production account. And that would mean that Pulisek is our target now, one of our targets, because that would be a really great permission.
Hey, Seth, we had a question here. Can SSM start session be used if SSM is not enabled on the box? Like, can it be used to enable SSM?
No. There's a couple of prerequisites. So for you to maliciously use, or not maliciously, for you to use that SSM start session permission, you need to have an EC2 instance that has the SSM instance core policy applied to it, and it has to have the SSM agent installed. Now, this is by default, I think, on Ubuntu 20 and later, and Amazon Linux 2. But for other operating systems, it's possible you just have to manually install that agent. Or if you're a penetration tester, the client must have, will have had to already install that for this permission to work maliciously.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we have a couple more modules that we can talk about. We can also answer any questions at this point. We've covered, there's a couple more, but we've covered most of them.
Seth, I had one. I just wanted to revisit something that you said at the beginning about the intent of CloudFox and helping differentiate the intent of CloudFox empowering and enabling the pen tester to work smarter, faster, versus spitting out a bunch of violations or things of that nature. Just to go back and reframe that now that we've had a chance to take a look at the tool.
Yeah. I mean, what you don't get is a finding. There's nothing in CloudFox that will give you a finding. But as a penetration tester, you'll realize that if there's a password in the user data script, or there is an API key in the Lambda environment variables, what you do then is you use the CloudFox modules to kind of work backwards in many cases, right? So let's say you find a sensitive credential in a Lambda environment variable. Your question should be, who has access to that Lambda environment variable? If it's only the DevOps team, if it's only the system administrators, that's not really that big of a deal, right? That's maybe it's not a best practice, but the impact is low. But if you have the interns, or you have somebody who is lower privileged and they have access to list Lambda functions, they have access to see that API key to in your environment variable, and that could be a very big deal, or whatever that secret is. And in the blog post, we give an example where the interns found the RDS database in the user data or the Lambda environment variable, and that gave them read-write access to the RDS database, when really they were just supposed to have limited read-only access to the account. So it's about giving you the tools to hunt around. In fact, some of the inspiration for CloudFox was Power View or Power Up, or CrackMap Exec. These are tools that also don't really give you direct findings. They give you breadcrumbs that you're supposed to, go down that rabbit hole, as you will.
Okay, excellent. And I just wanted to remind our audience too, now is the time for any questions. If you have any questions, feel free to post them up in the chat. One other question that we have here, Carlos, is for you. You mentioned earlier about a roadmap of future support. Where does Azure land up on that roadmap? Or I know roadmap questions could potentially be controversial, but anyhow, where does Azure land on that?
No, absolutely. Azure is probably going to be our next focus moving forward for development. As I mentioned earlier, there is still a couple modules available in the release version, and they work, but we're still fine-tuning the module. Seth and I, we talk about user experience a lot for the tool. Seth brings a lot of experience with open sourcing products, and we talk a lot about what is the best way to make this tool better for the user. And if the audience wants to drop any feedback on the GitHub repo, or suggest anything, or a module that you may want to see, we welcome that, because we want to make sure the user experience is prioritized on this. One thing that I will mention is that we try to keep CloudFox read-only on the cloud environment, at least for now. So the initial modules that we're gonna write for Azure are gonna follow the same format almost that we did for AWS. So you can see if like the Azure modules that we have right now are, they enumerate RBAC and enumerate instances, for example. And yeah, so this is kind of the roadmap. As we get more acquainted with the Azure SDK, and we dive deeper into the Azure SDK, we're definitely going to start adding more functionality around that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. We got one more question here. Any plans to also target Heroku and similar? Not sure if this is a relevant question or not, but ask it nonetheless.
No, absolutely. You want to take
ahead.
that one, Seth? No, go ahead. You
Oh, sure. It's a relevant question, but no plans to support Heroku at this point.
Okay, excellent. All right, we've got one more. You showed the CloudTrail example in the demo. Are ARNs automatically logged by CloudTrail, or does that have to be added?
I believe that assume role action automatically, if you have the management events logged, it automatically logs. But actually, I'm not positive. I'm not sure.
Okay. we can take a look and follow up afterwards. And as well, it's actually a pretty good segue to my next next part I wanted to mention too. If there's any questions that come up after this live stream, feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to take a look. Seth, Carlos, thank you so much for joining me today. And also thanks to our audience for joining us live to be part of the CloudFox launch. We've also published a blog detailing many of the topics we discussed today, so please check it out on bishopfox.com or check the links that we posted up in the chat. Also, let us know what you think of CloudFox. Reach out on our social media channels and tell us how your CloudFox journey is going. We look forward to seeing you at the next Tool Talk. And until then, take care and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.